Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the GPODS International Ideation Summit. We are joined here by our Global Policy, Diplomacy, and Sustainability Fellows. Today, we are going to be discussing some really interesting topics. Our first topic of the day right now is pathways to public participation. This particular discussion will be followed by two more discussions right after this. The discussion after this would be on waste management, as well as on our public policy for the outer space. Now, the two discussions that follow this panel discussion will be running parallelly. And for the discussion of public policy and diplomacy in the outer space, we'll be sharing a new link here in the chat box. So once it's there, and for people who want to join that particular session, you can just hop onto that link. For the waste management, cooperation, and public policy session, you guys can just stay onto this link. But welcome, and thank you for joining us from wherever you're joining us from different parts of the world. We are discussing a topic that is particularly close to my heart. I, being the Chief Executive Officer of Global Policy Insights and the Director of the GPODS Fellowship, I'm really passionate about public participation and governance. I teach a course at the GPODS Fellowship, which is on comparative public administration. And the fellows could attest to this, that we really do a deep dive into what public participation means and how different levels of governments ensure public participation to increase their effectiveness. Now, today we are joined by an eminent panel of our fellows who will be discussing various aspects about why public participation is important. What do we really mean by public participation? What are the various challenges when governments try to listen to the public, involve them into decision making, and help them implement some of their policies? Why it is successful in certain places, why it fails in other places. So I'm joined by Saeed Yunisa, who's a GPODS fellow. He's a WASH consultant with the Lutheran World Federation. He's also a Watson manager with Doctors Without Borders. We are also joined with Asma Ghulam Mohammed. She's a research analyst of market intelligence and core research services with Deloitte US India. Our third panelist today is Moritz Dappen. Moritz has been an advisor of public affairs to the permanent mission of the Federal Republic of Germany to the United Nations. And he has also served as an in-house consultant of the German Armed Forces, of the consulting firm which consults the German Armed Forces, which is called BW Consulting. We are joined by Sulekha Agrawal, another GPODS fellows. Sulekha holds a master's in international law from the Graduate Institute, Geneva, in international development studies. We are also joined by Ashutosh Patil, who is a graduate with BA and LLB, a graduate in law from the Symbiosis Law School, Pune. And he has researched on a number of areas from international law, public policy, and diplomacy. I'm glad to invite this panel for this discussion today. And I'd like to invite our panel members to first deliberate on the issue of why is public participation important and what do we really mean by public participation. So each of the fellows will be talking 2 minutes about this particular issue of getting a handle on why is public participation in government important. And then we are going to deep dive into the various facets of public participation. What are the things that we look over and that we should not, while we are aspiring to involve public in decision making for the government? And why does it succeed in some places and why does it fail? So that'll be our next half an hour of discussion after the opening statements. And towards the end, we're going to take the concluding remarks. I want to let you know, everybody in the audience, that the chat box will remain closed for a good part of the discussion and will only open out in the last half an hour. But meanwhile, stay tuned, think about the questions that you want to ask or the comments you want to make towards the end of the panel discussion. And in the last half an hour, you'll be able to post it on the chat box, and we'll take those questions and ask our panelists about that. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Saeed to open the discussion for us. So Saeed, the same question for you, that why do you think public participation in government is important? And what do you think that what do we really mean by public participation in the first place?
Thank you very much, Alfred. It's a very, very much important issues. At the heart of democratic governance is public participation. And this has actually been a tool that is used by both party of the government and the public. In public participation, the word public actually talks about the people. And the people is those who get to elect who governs them in some instances in democratic dispensation. That's why it is said democratic dispensation has public participation at its core inside. And how do people in governance tend to engage people in public in terms of encompasses diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, which is the context of democratic dispensation. But what we've seen in most recently is that people use this as a tool to actually push forward predetermined plan to the people by establishing a forum. And another disheartening aspect from the public is the public has actually neglected their role in seeking for a platform to actually be able to participate in governance. And this resulted in the fact that participation is now a nonchalant idea, which is a form of participation for the people. So emerging consent is that participation, non-participation is a form of participation. Participation is actually very much important in the sense that there is an action arena where people tend to share their positions, they have to share their interests with other people in order to improve service delivery to them and also development as well. So I will see public participation as an action arena using international development and international analysis and development framework by Lina Ostrom to be able to see where parties are actually being engaged towards from towards being an effective citizen, because the government has a role to provide and institutions to engage people. Why the people also needs to demand to be engaged so as to ensure that what the government actually proposed to do is beneficial to the public. So participation is actually very much important. But the key to which people need to realize is that a form of non-participation is a form of participation in the actual sense of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed. You bring a very interesting point to the picture, that non-participation in itself is participation as well. Uh, Before I move on to Sulekha to elaborate on public participation as a concept, would you like to tell us, Saeed, a little bit more about how non-participation, as you rightly say, also becomes participation?
Yeah, most of the time the government actually puts forward a predetermined plan in a forum. How do they do this? They put a tool like a survey to actually be able to collect information from people. And that's a way of manipulating the people, because in the actual sense, you need to make a proposal to the people where people need to react to them, need to show their stance, need to show their opinion about why it works or why it's not going to work. And advancing from that, from in terms of providing using participation as a tool to manipulate the people such a way that you just get a little bit of a sense from them, and you attempt towards controlling them, which of course you don't really need what they wanted to put in terms of an input. And also we can move to the aspect of tokenism, which is also very much of trying to put people in a place where you presume as if they are participating, but they
Right.
weren't participating. So that's actually what it's meant by saying non-participation by people, where people even don't attend forums is a means of participation, because whatever the government push to them, they will have no decisions to make towards it.
Now, certainly an interesting perspective, Saeed. Sulekha, building off of what Saeed said, that a lot of times what happens is that governments, they do just the minimal bit to ensure on paper that the public has been participating. Uh, why do you think that's, why do you think that there's a need in the government to show that there is some bit of public participation that is present in their own domain? But at the same time, why do you think there is a desire on part of the government to not really involve the public in taking real decisions?
Right, you ask a very good question. So I will first start by explaining what I understand public participation to be, right? So
Sure.
it's simply for me means the existence of a possibility for each and everyone to be heard and participate in decision making on a societal level through legitimate means. So what it entails is that there exists a diversity of means through which you can participate. So it could be through the ballot, or it could be through protests, peaceful protests in the streets that we've been seeing world over. Now, for the government, it's easier to go through the ballot way because it is structurally instituted, right? But there are certain, let's say, there exists certain structural deformities that cannot be corrected to the ballot. Structural against fertility. You need to take.
Sulekha, I think you're breaking up a little. So do you want to?
The government towards environmental legislation, for example, you have to be consulted. Am I audible?
You're breaking up a little. So how about we try to repeat what you've said, but without the video?
Sure. Where was the last time you could hear me?
So I think you broke out pretty early on. We heard that a lot of times the government needs legitimacy, and that's the reason why they do it. And then after that, it started breaking off.
Sure. So what I mean by legitimacy is once you, for example, there are two ways you could participate. Of course, there exist a variety of ways, but I take the example of the ballot, where you vote by popular vote, you determine who your government is, and you protest on the streets. So it's easier through the ballot because it's structurally ensured that things will work in a certain way on paper. Yeah. But when it comes to structural problems, let's say against discrimination against minorities or certain other groups, you have to take protests to the streets, and that requires extreme amount of government engagement and structural change, because these have been going, it's not something that is an immediate problem. It has been going on for decades or even centuries, for example. So these things become much easier for the government to prove. Similarly, if you look at the EIA consultation process, which is environmental impact assessments, so equivalents of this exist all over the world, where when there's a project, there's a development project affecting the environmental interests of a community, they need to be consulted. But when you implement that on paper, it's easy to prove. But what these processes assume that the communities, the public, is a monolith, which is not exactly the case. There exists a diversity of interests in that, what we group under what is called public.
Right.
So that just makes it, that brings in the complexities of what we call public participation in. And then I will take you back to what Saeed said. So how I see public participation is who, whom, and how much. So how has been addressed by Saeed, but who is, again, who is the public? Who is speaking for what community? Who is conducting? For example, we normally understand is the government who's engaging the citizenry for public participation, but we do not essentially see that is the case. For example, we see reputed corporations conducting polls, and people giving their vote confidence or for or against is normally assumed by them to be an act of public participation, which may or may not be so. And how much is, again, a big question. For example, I will take the example, the farmer protests that's been happening in India. And we see it's largely the Sikh community that has been protesting. And now they've brought in the diaspora world over and involved world governments who've been commenting. So then how do you determine how much of that is public participation? So I see public participation a very complex problem. And if you look at it in that way, public participation is also a means to an end and an end itself. And I will leave at that.
You have made some really important points that are worth thinking about. First of all, and if I were to build on this whole framework that you've given about who, whom, and how much, I think that itself poses a lot of questions and brings in a lot of complexities, which needs to be addressed in public participation. Because, as you said, if you don't answer the question of who, then you're taking the public as a monolith, and you're probably talking to a small sample of people and making promulgating a policy for the whole nation. And then the second bit that you said, that who is inviting the public for participation? Is it a particular corporate which might have a particular self-interest? What we see in, as we were discussing once, a lot of these tech corporates coming up with smart city solutions based on civil participation, and then pushing technology, presenting the solution to the government in a way that technology is the only thing which is required for the cities of the future. So who is doing it? And finally, how much is just filling out a survey public participation enough, or do the public need to be involved in evaluating the project, in co-creating the projects, in implementing the project? So I think that's a very important thing. I think one thing perhaps I'll take from Sulekha and give it to Moritz to think about is, while explaining what's the importance of public participation and what we mean by it, perhaps Moritz, if you could throw some light on the fact that why is just the ballot not enough? Why do we need public participation in the first place? Why not just have the regular elections? And perhaps Sulekha can build upon that later on once we have our opening statements done. Why not just the regular elections? Why do people have to come to the streets to protest, and their legislators are not able to fulfill their demands? So over to you, Moritz.
Thanks for this quite interesting question. And yes, of course, we need this public participation, because to my mind, you have always a problem that government think it's done when they are elected. But I can give you a small example from Germany to an initiative, and why in this way public participation is quite important. So in Germany, we have the German Zero Initiative, and in the German Zero Initiative, interested parties from all sectors discuss German climate target based on the Paris Climate Agreement and drafting a corresponding law, which they then will present to the German parliament. The reason why they do it is that they are motivated by the lack of citizens' involvement in this process by the government, and especially because of its insufficient effort regarding a truly sustainable German climate strategy. So on the one side, you have, for example, parties you can elect, like the German Greens, and you think as a normal citizen, oh yeah, well, they stand for my interest. They will give my
take care of it.
Yeah, they take care on my interests, and on climate change. But as it is in a parliament, you are discussing, and often your own or party's interests are falling from the table because of more important other things. And as we can see right now in Germany, there is no real strategy in climate change. And that's why we have, for example, those public participation in our Fridays for Futures from the schools and other interested citizens, and now as well a Green Zero Initiative, where people really are acting and producing something. And that's why it is important, because the parliament or the government is not always likely to follow the points you elected them to, and especially in every country in the world. So, and that's why, for example, for myself, this, as we already talked about, you can divide public participation in an informal and a formal way. And I guess the formal way, we are more often talking about, like that there are authorities which give the public the right to be involved in their decision-making processes and to influence the decision with their contribution. But to my mind, there is a bigger effect when citizens self-organize participation in public life. That means that people act on things out of their own responsibility and motivation because they think that some politics are not going well in their country. And coming back to my example, I guess that's the reason why that's important, that public participation takes place in our societies, to get important things done.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I think one thing that I draw from what you said is when you look at decision making from a purely conventional democratic perspective, that you elect political leaders who belong to parties and then they bring about change, we forget that parties have to make compromises. They are being pulled in different directions all the time, and that's why a lot of times they could lose their initial platform for which they have been elected. So it's almost like a 2-period game where you say that you're going to do this, but then once you're there in the parliament, there are all of these different pressures that are being exercised upon you, and then you have to make compromises. So for that, I think it's just good citizenship and good democracy for people to not just sit back and parcelize their democratic powers to somebody else, but take charge and do things themselves.
Right.
And with that, I'd like to invite Asma. And Asma, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about. Yeah. Sorry about that. So Asma, if you could talk a little bit about what, again, do you think are the perspectives that we miss out on when we talk about public participation? We all think it's important, we all consider it desirable, but then it's one of those things that everybody wants, but nobody really knows what it is.
That's a good question, Arpit. So I'd like to draw from what Sulekha and Moritz said. Moritz was talking about how often, Sulekha, Moritz and Sahid were talking about how often parties lose track of what is important to their electorate. One thing that we don't consider very often is the lack of representation of women in politics. So there's a huge gender deficit. And while this is considered every time elections roll around, so every time you have elections, say in India, parties will talk about how they will institute a quota or reservation system for women once they come into power, but that hardly ever sees the light of day. And the reason that I'm bringing up gender is because in 1995, only 12 countries across the world had women as heads of state. Cut to 2.5 decades later, in 2020, the number is at 20. 20 countries have women as heads of state. Yeah. And this is not limited to the highest power, positions of power in countries. Even across national parliaments, I believe it's around 25% of the seats that women occupy across the globe. There are very few countries that are an exception to this that have some gender parity, but generally there's a very big gender deficit. Now, the reason that I talk about the gender deficit is because if you exclude 1/2 of your citizens from policy making, it's very difficult to expect their interests to be represented across in countries. And that's the reason that I believe that we need institutional change and not just grassroots level change and grassroots level reform. Because the issues that face women, the impediments that face women while entering politics are highly institutionalized. So in the interest of time, I'll just talk about two impediments. One is fundraising for campaigns. Now, intuitively, that is very important. You need funds to be able to have a successful campaign. But here comes the issue of the gender wealth gap. So it's been well documented over several decades now that there is a gender wealth gap between men and women. And that it's just limited to that. Also, when it comes to parties, so they have candidate selection committees or some form of that across the globe. So they're more likely to favor male candidates over female candidates because they feel like male candidates are a safer bet, which makes sense. But how is that going to change things if you allow incumbents access to power again? If you allow incumbents, male incumbents, access to electoral lists, that isn't going to change things. Another issue is the issue of gender roles. So I did a little research before this panel for the sake of this, and it's much bigger. The problem is much bigger than I could comprehend before. So when it comes to women who have young children who are contesting elections, the question arises in the general public about how women will be able to manage the expectations of children, young children, while also fulfilling their duties. But in case women don't have children, then the general rhetoric is, how will you be able to understand what families face? So either ways, there is no way to win. And this
I mean,
is
the
not
world has seen a prime minister who has, given birth to a child during her tenure, right? So,
but even the Jacinda Ardern, I believe, is the person you're talking about. Even while she was before she became head of state in 2017, she was asked when she would have children, and she said that this is not a question we should be asking right now. So when men in power, when men politicians or heads of state have children, it adds to their image. So they're given this wholesome look of a family man. But that isn't the case for women. And you'll also see that, so this is an observation that I am making. I don't know if this is true or not, but in the West, at least, when you see male candidates standing for elections or when they win, you'll see them often with their families, with their children, with their spouses. That isn't true very often for female candidates. The only exception I can think of to this example is Sarah Palin in 2008. But apart from that, I don't see this happening very often. So I think that we need to focus a lot on gender as well while talking about public participation.
Interesting. And why do you think that is the case? Maybe we have some, political image consultants in the audience over here who might be able to shed some light on this, that why won't you see the women leaders with their families so much? Probably they don't want to come across as too dependent, or I don't know, there must be some political image reason behind that. But I'd like to build upon one point that you brought up, which really shows that perhaps public participation has an edge over our conventional democratic systems, wherein we elect leaders and then let them take decisions for us. Because in the conventional system, we have seen reservation for women. In India, at the local government level, we have experimented with having seats reserved for women, and we are talking about that a similar model at the parliamentary level as well. But then studies after studies after studies have shown that women a lot of times are pitched as dummy candidates as well, and in place of them, it is their husbands or their sons who are managing the constituency. So a lot of times people find their ways to work around the system. I have a feeling that if we do not just rely on that conventional system and really get women in numbers to participate, to make decisions about policy matters, as a matter of habit, as a matter of convention, they all need not be elected leaders all the time, although we need more women elected leaders for sure. But then if we have more women, and similarly, other sections who have been underserved in the society, the scheduled castes, certain races, if they come and participate on a regular basis in decision making, it could make all the difference. It could make all the difference. You do not always have to rely on somebody that you elect, because that can have people trying to find a way around the system.
I'd like to add something here, Arpit, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
So with regards to the proxy, the existence of women as proxies, that's quite true. There is quite a bit of literature about how that is an issue as well. But I was reading up about this too. And even then, despite all that, so this law that you're speaking of, the law in India that provides for 1/3 reservation at the village level, at the village council level, it was instituted in 1993. So in 2013, there was a paper published by the Harvard Kennedy School And there's research from the UN as well that despite the existence of proxies, it was found that villages that had women as the village chiefs, I believe that's the term that they use, women as the village chiefs, those villages had a higher instance of expenditure or investment
on healthcare and
in education, in roads and drinking water. So whether or not women are being used as and there's also the instance of the role model effect. So when villagers see women in power and in positions of power, they're more inclined to let their daughters study a little more than they would otherwise. And young girls as well have the aspiration that they can accede to such positions of power.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there are studies in a number of nations with parliamentarians that wherever women parliamentarians have been elected, you see greater focus and greater expenditure on issues related to health, water, sanitation, education, things like that. But at the same time, I think my point over there was that, okay, that's something that we have, but should we stop there? Should we not include women and people of different sections who have been traditionally underserved in numbers through public participation as a process, so that we do not just have to rely on this limited reservation that is institutionalized. It has its merits, but then should we stop there? I don't know. I see Sulekha, you want to add something to this. So before I go to Ashutosh, Sulekha, do you want to quickly jump in?
Yes, I just wanted to add to Asma's point, and of course what you mentioned, that in COVID situation, a lot of reputed journals have been covering that countries which had women as leaders have been doing much well in COVID response. So that just goes to add to Asma's point that this is an important section of society and a lot of talent that we are missing out on.
Absolutely, Sulekha. Point well made. As Asma said that if we do not include women, we are losing out on the potential of half of our population. And with that, I'd like to move to Ashutosh. And Ashutosh, what are your views on the importance of public participation, and how would you define it? What do you think it means?
Thank you so much, Arpit. So the first thing, so I would like to start my opening remarks by quoting this famous statement by John Stuart Mill, who we all know is a very famous thinker, who said that like democracy is nothing but a government which can run only by discussion. And for the very first time when I heard this the word public participation, my mind pondered over 3 to 4 major words, which included dissent, debate, discussion, and the right to protest. And these things are very evident in the past decade or so, where we have seen that the basic tenets of democracy are being somewhere subjugated due to some factors. And that is something which takes me to the point as to what is public participation. And public participation is a continuous process where people are have to be brought into the decision-making process. So many times in several democracies, we feel that that voting is absolutely it's one of the most basic right, exercising your franchisee, because once upon a time, many groups were not allowed to vote due to certain factors. So, but the fact that, as Sahid usually actually mentioned in this inaugural remarks, that whether people actually know the importance of the vote. So I just like to put some questions as to how many of them actually read the election manifestos, apart from the fact that we go through the media, the papers, but we don't know actually what is written in the manifestos, and we just vote. So which sometimes makes us to are people actually aware about what their interest is and the interest for the total community is. And that is one of the basic tenets of how we can improve public participation. And to moving over to it's all about to identify the stakeholders. And over the period of last 3 months, what I have found the biggest takeaway of this particular fellowship was to identify who the stakeholders are. And when we elect those people in power, with respect and those who govern us, sometimes the connect between the electors and the elected sometimes gets to it becomes a little blur, because in most of the countries it's more like elections are held for once in 5 years. So there is a huge gap between as to whether the policies are being implemented in the right way, whether they're taking the right step. Because Sulekha mentioned the farmer laws, the protests over here in India happening, and all across the world there's several interest groups are protesting. But would that happen if among the farmer leaders was part of that particular high table where actually this policy was being taken? Maybe not. So very to sum it up, so very important to know as to who the interest groups are, who the stakeholders are, and when the government or the elected fail to do so, then I think we have to make a place in that high table rather than maybe just passing the buck. So this would be my definition of what public participation is all.
I agree, Ashutosh, and to what you said earlier about public participation and democracy, that it is to debate, it is to discuss, it is to protest. Let us also add another aspect to it, that it is the ability and the power to make decisions, so to decide. And once you give that power directly in the hands of the public, good things start happening. In fact, to add to what you said, one of the first instances of organized public participation that we see, as we have been discussing, has been in Porto Alegre in Brazil. And studies show that people, I'm talking about this because you mentioned that there have been, regular voters, they don't read the manifestos, they don't educate themselves enough on policy moot points. And what studies have shown that in Porto Alegre and then after that in other areas in Argentina as well, that after people start participating directly, even if it is for deciding what the budget should be for their local municipality, they start educating themselves more and more on some of these key policy issues that they may not be investing enough time in earlier. So it's also a way to inculcate those values and culture of democracy amongst the people.
Yeah, I would just like to add one more point. As you mentioned that you mentioned Porto Alegre. So there are two major movements which actually I have read extensively about. One is the Tea Party movement in the US, and the other one is the rise of Aam Aadmi Party. Now, for those of whom are joining. Now, the Aam Aadmi Party is the current party which is governing the capital city of Delhi. So what are like the Tea Party movement was basically it started on how the major stakeholders could work on reducing tariffs, on the high tax rates in US. And then we realized that most of those leaders of Tea Party movement became very major leaders. Like maybe Ronald Reagan ended up becoming the president. So the so-called conservatives and who were actually supporting this movement. And also the Aam Aadmi Party. Now, this Aam Aadmi Party was not relevant maybe 2 decades ago. We never thought this was only common people. There was actually a public mass movement, which by the name of India Against Corruption, which started in Delhi in 2011. And then we realized it's just common people, the middle class people who just came together, discussed, debated, and then realized that, okay, one day this actually party would govern a city like Delhi, and conventional parties like BJP and Congress will have a challenger. So I think this is one of the major success stories. Maybe you can call it a political party or a startup or a major disruption in politics. So this is one of the major advantages of how public participation can actually create a change.
And in fact, for people who are interested in knowing more about how this particular party especially does their manifesto by consulting with people and does their budget, there's a movie, I'm forgetting the name of that movie. Is it called The Common Man? Or there's a nice documentary made on
Insignificant Man.
An Insignificant Man. That's right. So for those who want to check out how this all started, I think it's a nice ready reckoner of sorts. But I know Saeed has been itching to say something on what we've been discussing. So Saeed, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Yeah, I think it's very, very much important that Ashu actually mentioned some things about why people actually fail to understand that they need to also be empowered to be able to generate demand for public participation in the public fair. And we could see that comparatively for looking at the development of the developed world and also the developing world viewpoint. In the developed world, we have the civil society who readily empower people to be able to generate demand for participation. Look at the civil liberty movement by Martin Luther King, which of course had to create a lot of change and the sphere of influence of America today. And looking at developing country, that has actually not happened. And this is why we need to really, really talk to a lot of government or government officials watching this particular platform should be able to understand that they need the people to be able to ensure that the service delivery they are trying, they planned or they've delivered can actually be more sustainable. Like for instance, if you eliminate the youth from your discussion, how do you want some of those projects to be more sustainable? If they eliminate the women from your discussion, how do you want important topics like water to actually be talked about effectively, and how its impact is going to be incremental or multiplying in terms of effect? So empowering the people to understand their participation is actually very, very much important from the civil society organization. While from the government, providing a lively environment is very key, because if people actually had to generate demand in participation, how could they be able to talk to the government? The government needs to find an institution, the forums where people can actually be able to understand from the context of what are the proposal, what are the strategies that are in place. And that actually talks about what Moritz is emphasizing on. Moritz was emphasizing on that there was dichotomy of power or dichotomy of interventions in Germany concerning the strategies they were trying to put in place. It's because the government is not providing a wholesome kind of a forum where diversity is appreciated, position of people is actually put in place, and where people can actually share their opinion on how a strategy can be put in place, how it's going to affect them, what is their position, what is their interest, and how they can actually move forward with the intervention or the potential outcome. And we can have a kind of a or superior solution. So I felt enabling environment is actually very much key in several instances where democratic dispensation actually being practiced. And in some other countries, like the UAE, they've also brought about this digital technology as a tool towards driving citizen science, towards informing the citizen on the roles and responsibility. And this is actually very much key. If democratic dispensation can also use the mobile devices to inform people about what is going on, to engage people that are actually marginalized from governmental forums, to actually educate them on what exactly is their role in terms of benefiting from the common resources. So I felt that on the government side, and as well as on the people side, we have a very key role to play. On the government side, providing an enabling environment. On the people side, generating a lot of demand and empowerment. And by so doing that, public participation will be very, very much key in our development.
I agree, Saeed. And what I feel is that there's a lot of information asymmetry when policy decisions are being taken, because there's a lot of knowledge that the elected leaders come across, which and knowledge about various constraints, knowledge about various resources, knowledge about various opportunities that the public doesn't have. It's almost like the information asymmetry that exists between a doctor and a patient, because the doctor knows, this is the nature of the disease, these are the medicines which are available, this is the cost of the medicines. So the doctor understands that ecosystem, the patient does not. And that information asymmetry causes a lot of market failure. And I think technology, as you rightly mentioned, can bridge those gaps. Technology can really help the people to understand the various resources which can be utilized, the various opportunities which are there, and not just get to know of these things in a one-way format. Now we have technology which can work communications in both directions, where people can directly send feedback, and it's already happening in a number of places across the world, where people can send feedback, people can have their voice heard in decisions, and people can track whether the recommendations that they've made or the demands that they've made on the government have been fulfilled, all by the use of technology.
Yeah, in addition to that, I will give you a very typical example of what happened. The EdSense campaign that actually happened in Nigeria currently, where
Mhm.
the government, where the public is actually holding the government responsible for good governance. What happened during those times is that the Twitter was actually flooded with a lot of information of what was happening in
Right.
terms of the fact that they had the police brutality in the country, trying to harass some set of people, and they've been doing that over the years, killing people indiscriminately. But some youth were able to put up a position and say, "Oh, this is enough is enough." And through
Mhm.
that, with the use of Twitter, it all went viral. Everybody started seeking for EdSense campaign in the country. So I think technology has become a tool to hold the government accountable. And through that, people can have a lot of information what was happening. People that are actually far away from the country started holding far away from the segment of the country where it was actually happening, and start holding protests. And like Ashu has said, protest is one key to actually ensure public participation. So I think, in my view, technology has actually helped to actually push forward, to ensure people participate in governance, holding government accountable for their actions.
And not only that, I absolutely agree. Not only that, just my last bit on the technology front is that even in developed countries, I've worked with local governments in the US, both on the East and the West Coast. And what I realized is that mayors after mayors are not able to crack this problem, that when they want to institute a new project, they are now supposed to call on the public to give their inputs and their feedback, and they typically do this through a town hall. And the way that the bureaucracy works is that the town hall will be done in the city center at, let's say, 4 p.m. on a Wednesday. Now, in a world where there's no technology that exists, whom do you think is going to attend those town halls? Just the few people who are motivated and self-interested to bring about the change, in a very narrow, self-interested manner. So I think that technology can revolutionize all of these, space, distance barriers, and cost barriers to public participation. And with that, I'd like to now open it out to our panel. And perhaps, we could build a little bit on the technology aspect that we've discussed. And at some point of time, I'd also want to discuss about the issue of political will. Another thing that Saeed mentioned, that a lot of times public participation has to happen with political will. And wherever we have seen it successful, for example, in Porto Alegre in Brazil, or at the Aam Aadmi Party, initiating public budgeting in New Delhi, we see that it is a political party which is committed towards public participation, and that's where it becomes successful. So why does that become so important, and why would a government be incentivized, or how would a government be incentivized to move towards the public participation way, rather than doing it in small coteries and in backroom lobbies? That's one thing to deliberate upon. So over to you guys.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna start.
Sure,
Yeah, what I found quite interesting, especially with regard to your two questions, is that everything starts with the mindset. Especially. So what I mean with this is to the mindset. Yeah, well, with the mindset is, I guess lots of people in our countries doesn't really know how to participate correctly. For example, when I think about my time at school, yeah, we were
right.
just taught in tailor-made schedules to pass exams, but not to think about real-life decisions or current political issues. Yeah, and when we left school, we were not very well prepared, and were not prepared to really think about that we have a possibility to participate in all the things going around in the political area. So what I mean is that, of course, there are people who have maybe the possibility and the mindset from home, yeah, that they maybe go on deepen their knowledge in those political issues through technology. Yeah, so the possibility is there. But on the other side, I guess in most of the countries, people are not really prepared to open their mind up for discussions and to open their mind for other opinions. Yeah, and to discuss things maybe a little bit on a differentiate, so on a yeah, from different perspective. You know, what I basically mean is, I guess the big problem, which I guess most of the societies face, is that people are not interested because they haven't even learned to be interested in those things. Yeah. So I, to myself, can say, okay, I had the luck to have parents and friends around me who influenced me. But there are lots of people around who hadn't this chance. Yeah. And I guess what we need to think about, or especially governments needs to think about, is how to integrate political mindset in teaching, in the shadows of schools, in universities. It is, you will find it, but not in the school. So we are not prepared to really participate. I don't know whether governments don't want it or are not willing to do it. Yeah, but in the end, it is a huge problem, because most of the people around me, they're just interested in their own things, in their own home, in their work. But what's going on, yeah, beside, for example, the coronavirus, they are not interested in. And that's an idea, yeah, especially for government and for social media, to let people, to help people, yeah, to improve in thinking about issues on a yeah, multi-perspective way. Because in the end, what we will see, for example, is that that there's always the danger that people are just discussing in their own community and do not generate new perspectives on specific issues.
In their echo chambers, yeah.
Yeah, and to change this, a government must be willing to do so, as from the scratch on, yeah, from the early childhood on, to teach people in participation, yeah, and to give them the possibility via technology to do so, yeah, and using technology, especially in classes, yeah, and so that's what I mean with starting with a mindset, you know, because I think most of the people don't have a mindset in public participation.
Yeah,
Moritz,
just like
it's an amazing point. Go ahead, Saeed. I have some thoughts, but I'll go after you. Yeah.
Yeah. Just like Moritz has actually said, I think in developing countries, from my kind of experience working across so many countries in Africa and also in developed countries, I found out that skewed public participation is as a result of colonization and relics of colonial imperialism. And if we looked at it, there's a common factor: male dominated and elite driven.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the governments actually focused on male dominated. Like Asma was trying to talk about gender, we need to put the female folks, it has to be inclusive with the female folks, where we can actually show some vital topics, or from like water, like earth system, could be much more deliberated. And of course, if we could actually do this by reformation of the government thinking around public participation. By the way, and in traditional African setting, public participation was actually very key, because there were always establishment of council, which of course, from each of this council, they have gatekeepers, they have influencer, market women, actually does the listening to the people, trying to understand what the plight of the people before it was being conveyed to the council itself. This has actually been eradicated. And most what is done in the government is what is going to be the interest of the elite? What is the elite going to benefit from a particular program, a particular government, is what is quite important. So there's a need for a reconfiguration of thinking of the government to actually see that what they are trying to achieve over the time of the tenure is to ensure that the provisions that is going to support the development of the people is what is achieved. Because the people always come as a politician, they come, they campaign, and after the election, they all want to satisfy the elite. And because the allies provide the money for it. So the thinking needs to change. We need to ensure that the people are the focus of the government. If we could have it on paper saying public participation is the center of democratic dispensation or democratic governance, it needs to reflect in reality. People need to see the public as a goods, as a service order, as a power order, in order to ensure things is done. And this is exactly what happened in the US recently, where we have the people trying to decide through the ballot who they want in the office. And this also needs to reflect from the government and in developing countries as to how to ensure that the people come first in their decision making.
Absolutely, Saeed. And in fact, what you're saying would really resonate with, two researchers, Denhart and Denhart, who talk about exactly this, that it's really public participation is about serving. It's not about steering the public towards what you already want. It's about serving the public and doing what they want. Couple of points that I'd like to build upon based on what you said and what Moritz said before you. Number one is that I completely agree that you can trace some of these roots in colonialism and not only just ex-colonial states, but then ex-Soviet states where this sort of a dystopian world has been created where people they don't believe that they can have the agency to improve their lives and take decisions by themselves. They always think that the person of influence, it could be a local mayor, it could be an elite, that group is going to take all of the decisions. They have all of the resources, and it's easy to relegate into that dystopian world. And I do believe that with institutionalized public participation, which I personally feel is more institutionalized in developing countries than the developed countries in practice, not just on papers but in practice, because a lot of these developing countries have had a culture, as you were mentioning, that in Africa there have been these councils. And in fact, the first time I learned about it when I was reading Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela, and he gives a very pictorial description of how these councils would work. I think with those legacies, it comes to some of these developing countries more naturally than the developed ones. So lots of opportunities over there. Now, I know Sulekha wants to make a few points on this. Sulekha, do you want to join in?
Sure. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. So I think Saeed, Moritz, and you bring out brilliant points because of colonialization and structures. So in the post-colonial societies, most of these countries continued with the system of governance that they had once the colonial institution was established. Mm-hmm. What that did was it came at a price of local governance systems, right? So India tried to instill that to an extent through Panchayati Raj institutions, but then there's Panchayati Raj is not the only way, even within India itself. So if you look at the northeast part of the country, there exist hill councils, they have their own system of governance. And what happens is if you impose an external sort of framework on people, it's very difficult for them to realize themselves within this framework. But if you encourage people to work within the framework that they are used to, that will normally increase public participation, right? So the idea is that we should be looking at alternative ways of public participation, and also more so decentralized. For example, Morris brought out this very important point of climate change. Climate change impacts are going to be very different in very different regions. So once you have these institutions which are very localized, which are close to their culture and understanding, that's only going to increase public participation. And we really do need to move away with these imposed structural models if we are to have any sort of effective public participation.
Absolutely. And I think the example that you give of the Hills Council drives the point home, because if you're going to give a group of people a very foreign structure, which has no roots in the way that they've been self-organizing for centuries, it's not going to work. It's going to fall flat on its face. So you have to root the new systems, respecting and keeping in mind the local customs and traditions, if that's what you're saying. So while we open out the chat box, I it would be remiss of me to not emphasize one point that Moritz mentioned, and I think it is super interesting, that when we are in schools, whether it is by design or it's just the way that things have panned out, I don't remember, or I don't know of a school, and in my own schooling, I don't remember if I was asked to make a decision on what schedule fits best for me. So these are some of the trainings, as Moritz rightly pointed out. It's not taught to us when we are growing up. And suddenly one day we are expected to decide how the government should take decisions and how things should run in my particular community. So I think that, Moritz, that was a point well made. I know Asma has a point related to this, so Asma, I'll give it over to you.
Thank you, Arpit. So I don't have any solutions about how we can encourage governments to support public participation, but I agree with what all of you are saying. So I didn't think about this until this was said, until Moritz and Sahid brought this up, that we aren't encouraged at a school level to take a part in politics. So it's something that's true of what happened to me as well. I never considered this as an option until I had the option of attending fellowships where I heard that advocacy and other ways were existed for public participation as well. But I want to talk about one thing in addition to this. So there are certain ways in which political parties, without actual force from the government, are encouraging the participation of women in politics. So there's a party in Canada, the New Democratic Party, which subsidizes or which reimburses female candidates for childcare, because this is actually true of the world in general, that women spend twice as much time in childcare and other household related duties as men. So, and this is an impediment for a lot of women who want to enter politics. The actual the finances of it, how they'll finance their run and how they'll take care of their responsibilities at home. So certain parties the world over are reimbursing childcare expenditures that women incur while running for elections or while in office. And in the US in 2019, several states passed laws allowing for women to use women in state legislatures or to use campaign funds for childcare as well. So quite a few states passed laws supporting this. A couple of states passed laws against this as well, but some progress is progress. And this has been occurring at the federal level in the US as well. I don't know of any equivalent in India, unfortunately, but hopefully this will trigger such actions across the world. Another thing that I want to talk about was the fact that when you have women's groups or women's sections in political parties, that also pushes parties to field more candidates that who are women. So one example that I read of was the African National Congress, the ANC in South Africa. So when they had a strong women's league that pushed for the party to have 1/3 reservation. So there was no government forcing, there was no legislation that pushed the party to do this. It was just the fact that the women's league was that powerful that the party had 1/3 candidates. I believe it was 1/3 candidates that were women. And this has happened in Mexico as well. So I believe that even if you don't have legislation at the top that pushes for women to get more representation, just having women in political parties or having parties that are open to the option of having women as candidates or women as members can have a great impact as well.
No, absolutely, I agree. And, that takes me to what we were discussing in systems thinking, that if you have certain elements in the system in place, there are emergent properties that arise out of just those paths being there in the system that lead to a particular behavior. So in this case, if there are more women participating in politics, there'll be greater focus to some of these things such as healthcare, education, as we were discussing earlier about, but also there'll be greater vocalization of the need for women to actively participate in politics. So I think that that's a message for a lot of us here on the panel and in the audience, that let's have more women participating in politics, formally, informally, however we can.
Yes, I'd like to add one more thing, just because of what you said, that the fact that having more women encourages more women. So
Asma, I think you froze. Okay, we'll get
come in and maybe Asma can make a point later on. So
sure. Ashutosh, Sulekha messaged me, so let's take Sulekha's point and then bring you in. Okay, great. Sulekha, do you want to go?
Yes, I would really like to add to Asma's point. I think including women just makes a lot of economic sense. So, for example, in COVID lockdowns, what happened was no one actually included women's issues into the problem. And then we had this upsurge of domestic violence. And that comes at a cost to the state, because all these agencies that work against these atrocities, they were overwhelmed with the number of queries they're getting world over. So
Yeah.
once you have these aspects represented, these you can actually deal with them at the basic stage. You don't have to incur those costs later on. So it just makes absolute economic sense at the very base of it.
Oh, certainly. It makes economic sense. It makes, a lot of sense just on a pure human rights level. At the same time, I also agree that, you know, one logic behind that, in addition to economic sense, is that there's only so many aspects that a single person or a small group of people can think about. I mean, now we are surprised and we are disgusted by the fact that a lot of these lockdown measures were taken without taking the aspect of domestic violence into account. And I feel that the reasons were that, as you rightly pointed and as Asma rightly pointed, that not enough women as elected leaders or in the political space, and B, we were still depending on the conventional ways of democracy without enough public participation and planning how a lockdown should, without enough voices being taken into account to design something as drastic as a lockdown. You are sure to miss out on multiple aspects, as we saw on the issue of migrant laborers in India, of women in India, of a number of other groups. If you haven't included those voices, there's only so much that a single civil servant or a small group of civil servants and politicians could think of. And Ashutosh, now over to you. Sorry for that little. Yeah.
Now, agreeing on every like all the points made, I would like to first, you mentioned about in the various institutions in the country. So Sulekha rightly mentioned that we have the Panchayati Raj, which was an amendment which was celebrated all across the country. But the fact that the governments and the people in power do not keep a check, so and that sometimes leads to the fact that we do not know how it is implemented, because Asma rightly mentioned that we do need more women from the grassroots level. But in most of the times what happens is women just participate because either as proxies to the family, and their voices are not really heard. So the reason is that we have to actually that there should be a time-based checking of all those policies which have been implemented, and that is why I feel the youth, the fact that a country like India or Nigeria or maybe China, where the majority, the demographic dividend is such that the majority of people are below the age of 45, 35, which clearly makes that the youth have to come in. I mean, this would be one of the biggest solutions as to how the youth can bring about a change. So I believe that with respect to how we can tackle information asymmetry, how we can make those rulers, listen to us. So I think the power of the youth is something which the audience as well as everyone have to realize. And in the past, we have seen that revolutions have led to fall of many empires in the past. History has shown that, and any tectonic shift or any transition or a change can come through the power of the youth. And it's not just limited to domestic issues only, but an issue like climate change, where yes, a lot of leaders have committed to, let's say, the fact that they will stick to the pledges which they made to the Paris Accord. But then who is the one who keeps check on them ultimately? It shouldn't end up, just like passing the buck. These are issues which can affect every single mankind, and the lower the bottom, the lower you go, those are the most affected. So I think that's how you can bring up their voice, and that's how we can say that this public participation can be enhanced or improved in some ways.
Absolutely. And fair point, Ashutosh. In fact, what you said is extremely important, that we do a constant check-in on where we are headed in terms of the policies. Are the policies that we had designed, are they really reaping the intended outcomes? Or we just said that, okay, we implemented a policy and we never got the outcome that we desired. uh, I I agree with that, but I'd like to add one more point to it, uh, by tying it back to what Sulekha had said earlier, that it also matters who is doing that check-in, who is doing that evaluation. And interestingly, there is a particular case study about the Iowa state where they tried to evaluate the effectiveness of certain policies as well as certain civil servants. And they did not evaluate it in the traditional way as we have it, not only in India but across the world, where uh, a senior civil servant is doing the performance evaluation of a junior one. What they did was that they trained groups of people for 6 months on how the life of a civil servant is, what are the decisions they can make, what are the outcomes that they can affect. And based on that rigorous 6-month training, this group of civic society participants evaluated policies, evaluated the performance of civil servants, and which I thought was fascinating. And that's something that, who does the evaluation also, matters a lot. So with that, I'm going to just jump into some of the questions that we've been asked, and I'm going to take up Deborah Charles's question first. And Deborah is asking, how do you change the mentality or pathology of the dominant group to choose morals? So I believe that Deborah is asking it in the context of, what is desirable in public policy and who decides that, and how do you change uh, the mental models of the current politicians to move to a more progressive sort of a democracy. So how do you do that? Anybody wants to comment on this?
Yeah, I would like to react to that. I think one of the things is empowerment. The first is getting to be empowered, have the right knowledge, competency to challenge the dominant group. And in this way, you can put up a very good argument against them. Secondly, is accountability. If you have the idea of how to hold the leaders accountable for their actions, we have the judiciary is there, the legislature is there to hold the executive accountable. And people do not have this knowledge of how to explore the opportunity of the judiciary to actually be able to hold government accountable for some of their actions. So accountability, empowerment is one key, accountability is the second. And civil disobedience was actually something that has been prominent. If we looked at the life of the history of the United States, Martin Luther King actually had to carry or conduct civil disobedience to be able to hold the government accountable. So I think one way to actually provide incentive for the government is to show that you're very much informed about the accountability framework of their actions, and you know the right to challenge them at several institutions. And of course, you have the right knowledge and the competency. With all this strict framework, we can be able to force government or an institution to choose morals than their dominant ideas.
Thank you, Saeed. I think that's, according to me, a great response to what Deborah asked. I'm sure if given the opportunity, perhaps Deborah and Saeed could connect later on to take this discussion forward, because given the limited time, we won't be able to deep dive into this, and it's a profound question which needs a lot of discussion for sure. But let me also pose another question, which I think is really interesting. Two questions lined up, so let me take Nirav's first and Ruchi's second. So Nirav is asking a very important question that would interest some of our panelists over here. And he's talking about scale. He's talking about the fact that while on an individual level, it's of foremost importance to have a larger perspective, another important point that needs to be addressed is that how do you bring in unity amongst the people? Awareness, he says, is usually created for specific individual local problems. How do you enforce the larger perspective on a larger scale more efficiently? So if I'm getting you right, Nirav, I think he's asking about two particular things: that how do you build consensus at scale, and how do you do that efficiently? Because things need to, you can't get slower in taking decisions. And as we know that, our conventional democracy is slow enough. So if you move to a public participation sort of a democracy, then that's going to be even slower. So consensus at scale. And the other thing is knowledge at scale, because people, they are more aware of the problems around them. So how do they get more aware? Can we involve people in taking decisions about, let's say, national security, about international cooperation, things that we had been discussing yesterday in our panel? So anybody wants to take this up?
Well,
okay, Moritz.
Moritz, then Said. Sure.
Okay. Well, I try to keep it short. Yeah. A very interesting question, and maybe I can give you an example. For example, in Ireland, we have the situation that for specific issues, the government, or especially the parliament, asks the people in the country to discuss on this issue or on the topic, and they do it in small caucuses. The people sitting in a caucus, they are randomly chosen from the public. So actually everyone can do it. Yeah. And the way they do it is they are, for some weeks, for a month, they are sitting together at the table discussing this topic. Yeah. And they always switch from one table to another table, from meeting to meeting. And in the end, they try to find consensus on this topic in the audience. So yeah, so all in all, this small caucus found maybe a decision on this topic, and all those caucuses in the country, they send then their decisions to the parliament, and the parliament can think about, well, shall we follow them or not? But what I mean with it is that could be, for example, a possibility to get people back on the table to discuss a topic which they are maybe not really into it, yeah, which they have no idea from, and for which they need to inform themselves and need to discuss different perspectives. So this is what I mean on a larger, to first of all think about a topic which on which you're not really interested maybe in, yeah, but you are randomly chosen, and to discuss your view on the topic with others to find compromises, yeah, and in the end to decide on this topic in a specific way, yeah. And this maybe takes people back to think more politically, to really think about the things things, for example, security matters, so security issues and economic issues on a national or international level, and yeah, to open up maybe their mind for different perspectives.
So Moritz, just a quick follow-up to that before I go to Said. So you're kind of talking about a very different worldview, a very different philosophy, where you don't need to be an expert to become knowledgeable on a particular subject and have your opinion heard. It's almost like a post-expertise worldview.
Well, yeah, it's like, no, but actually, you find those situations as well. For example, in Germany, there are next to in the court, for example, you also can be chosen to support the lawyers in the court. So
Mhm.
and you don't need to be from the subject.
Yeah.
Actually, you just have an open mind for this, for several issues, and you have the possibility then to contribute to this issue in a specific way. So, and this could be, for example, a way to do it. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And in fact, there's increasing amount of research which says that we put a higher premium on expertise than actually exists. If large number of people make similar estimates of, for example, where the stock is going to go, or a similar estimate of, how different policies are going to pan out, or what is correct in a particular decision and what is not, a lot of times they can trump the experts on accuracy. So thank you for that. Saeed, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the question is actually very fantastic because in democratic governance, public participations was actually meant to cater for diversity, for equity, and inclusiveness. And why did government try to attack it? They try to attack it by ensuring that they make public participation less effective. And that's why they employ the system of informing, consultation, like what Moritz just explained now. So how do we make public participation effective? Even why some governments or some institutions try to delegate power, decentralize power, and they also try as much as possible to curb the enabling environment where people can actually participate. So the major factor of it all is that we need to strengthen participation in its core essence. People need to be very much aware that if government is decentralized or delegating power, the people at the local government should be held accountable for all the powers the government has delegated to them. In an African setup, we have the local government. Where is the budget? The budget that's supposed to go to the local government is actually being occupied by the state government. What is people doing about that? People are not doing anything about it. And this, if the fund actually gets to the local government, people in the local government could have the diverse opinion of people to be able to address issue with. And that comes to the second aspect of understanding that public participation is a process. It's a process in the sense to bring different people together, to be able to hear their views and to be able to find a common interest amongst them. Public participation encourage compromise. It doesn't actually bring to the fact that different diverse group has to hear their opinion or achieve their interest at the time. There's always going to be compromise. But this same structure of public participation is being attacked. That's why you could not see a Yoruba man in my country and an Igbo man to sit together, because they want to divide them. And by dividing them, they actually be able to rule. So that's where the division comes. So if you can actually make a Yoruba man and an Hausa man and an Igbo man sit together, dialogue on their issues, state their position on it, and share their commonalities, where of course can actually lead to a very better outcome or solution for the government to spend their budget to actually implement a very, very good programs for the people that will be beneficial. So I think one aspect of it is realizing that public participation is a process. You have to allow people to go through the process, communicate with the local people, the marginalized people, this to be engaged, and you need to strengthen the information, the spread awareness. Like you said, information is very much important. So through this, I think we could be able to ensure that public participation take the front stage and effective participation from the people as well.
Said, fascinating. Every time you speak, it's just an amazing point that you make. And over here, I was reminded of again another discussion that we were having earlier, that whether public participation is a means to an end or is it an end in itself. And I think what you've rightly said is that it's both. It's both. It's a way of building consensus, and it's about getting people to talk to each other, people who are seemingly very different, to understand each other's side and to understand each other's point of view, almost as if it reminded me of this famous audio clip that is by Stephen Hawking. In fact, Pink Floyd has used it in one of its songs called Keep Talking, where he says that the way that we've evolved as human beings is because we've kept talking with each other. So the ability for us to communicate. So thank you so much for that, Saeed. We have one last question from Ruchi Bhatia, and I'm going to take that up. Ruchi and I, by the way, as a side, we've been good friends from the past. So Ruchi, it's nice to see you here. Ruchi is asking, and I can see why she's an accomplished HR leader in India. She's asking that how can HR consultants and HR business partners work with the government to create more progressive policies for the people. So partnership with the corporate citizens is also a form of public participation. So how do you are there ways to enhance that? So Ashutosh, or I can see you nodding your head, so I'm just going to pose that question to you.
So I think this the reason I said yes, because I take this personally, because even though I'm not an HR consultant, I am a law student and a lawyer. I was, like, most of the times when my peer group used to look for internships and placements at a corporate firm, I'm throughout my career I've looked at working with the government at any level.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because you always know, you think from a perspective of a common man or a citizen, but you also have to know as to how the government functions. And that's how you can actually create a change, because you have to realize how the government functions, the bureaucracy in the country, any country for that matter. So I would suggest, Ruchi, to actually look for any opportunity where you can actually intern with the high political officers, because maybe beginning with the Lok Sabha secretariat, maybe the important ministries, because they are not limited only to maybe people who have a law background or a political science background, but you need every stakeholder. That is how we can build this society. And this is a personal thing, because I've been looking, and fortunately I have got opportunities, because when I worked with a member of parliament, and I'm very aware that you have also had a lot of experience, so definitely you can share as well, more than me. So you tend to realize that what is their thinking, what is their frame mindset, and how do they see. Maybe yes, after elections they definitely have a lot of responsibilities in their desk, but then you realize that the way of thinking is something which we have to see from that officers, how they see their constituents, how they see the country's progress and what their vision is. So I would actually recommend that you have to look at this. And also with respect to Neeraj's question, so this saying that you have to think globally and act locally. That is how the real change can be brought, right? Maybe yes, national security, international relations, and foreign policy. So for now, let us leave that to the government. That is why we elect them. We look at how we can empower the local communities. The what do you call the people surrounding us. Maybe yes, conducting such group discussions on a very regular note. That would be a wonderful way to start with. And I think such ways are the ones which we have to look forward to create impact and create a real change, bring about a real change.
Absolutely. And once we champion that, perhaps we can also look forward to a day where we would be able to decide on issues related to foreign trade, foreign relations, and things like that through public participation. So thank you so much, Ashutosh, for that. And with this, we come to a close of this session. We'll take a 5-minute break before we start out with 2 parallel panels. One panel for which you'll have to log back onto this same link is called A Future of Waste Through Policy Cooperation and Sustainability. Fascinating panel if you're interested in waste management, if you're interested in knowing what do you really mean by waste, how do you change your perspective as you evolve that one person's waste becomes somebody else's livelihood. So that's the panel that we have in the next 5 minutes on the same link. On another link, we have a panel which we organized on special request from some of our community members, and that's aptly named as Beyond the Stratosphere, Policy, Diplomacy, and Sustainability for the Outer Space. So if you're interested in space policy, if you're wondering that why are organizations, why are countries again making a big push towards from things like colonizing Mars to infesting the atmosphere with more satellites, that's the panel for you. And you'd be surprised to know that space policy impacts not only the high and mighty at the top of the government. It impacts everybody, persons like you and me. So to find that out, we have another link that we've posted in the chat box, and we'll start with that discussion in another 5 minutes. So see you in both of these panels, and thank you for the current panel members for having such a fascinating discussion. Thank you, guys.
Those of you who have joined in again, and for those of you who stayed on since the last session, let me welcome you all to an extremely engaging discussion that we wish to have on a very, very pertinent topic. To give you a bit of anecdotal knowledge, after I completed my master's, I asked my mentor as to where I should be working, which country should I choose, and what field should I choose from. And he said that professions are a concoction of two important things. One is passion for what you are driven towards, and the second is where is the demand for the supply that you can give. And the natural outcome of that discussion was that the demand professionally in the policy field, in the legal field, was supposed to be that of waste and waste managers and waste policy analysts, because this is truly a global issue that is plaguing us all. And it is only supposed to increase. We'll touch upon some statistics on waste as we go along. But just to, this was just to give you an idea of how waste is supposed to be another one of those issues for the rest of the century that is supposed to follow. So that being said, let me quickly introduce the topic of our discussion for this session. This would be the last session of our 2-day International Ideation Summit organized by the Global Policy, Diplomacy and Sustainability Fellowship. As you might know by now, in case we haven't made it evident enough and spammed you enough in the chat box, the topic of discussion for this session is a future of waste through policy, cooperation, and sustainability. We would be having a structured discussion with opening statements, about half an hour of discussion on the topic, and then possibly take some questions and answers from the chat box that would be open in, say, the last 20 minutes of the session. So that being said, let me introduce the panelists. As you have seen some of them in the last session, we are joined by Saheed and Sulekha, who after their engaging discussion do not need any introduction anymore. We're also joined by Noopur and Marie, who would be taking part in this discussion. It's great to have you guys. Thank you so much to Saheed and Sulekha for giving back-to-back engaging discussions, hopefully starting with this one. And I'll also welcome Noopur and Marie, who have been a part of a lot of discussions over waste and all things environment in the classes that we've had of the GPODS fellowship over the past few months now. It's hard to believe that it's been a few months. So let me just open it up right at the beginning. As I said, we're dealing with a topic that is supposed to be a topic for a couple of decades at least, if we're not able to handle it, and depending on how well we handle it, probably a couple of centuries. So as I said, waste is a global problem, but waste is also as much of a local problem as it is global. It has within its paradigms issues of policy, regulation, economy, fiscal benefits, deficits, governmental issues, IR issues, public policy issues at the heart of it. So we have a lot of ground to cover. And that is the reason why I'm going to get too greedy, and I'm just going to start with the opening statement. So if it's all right with everyone, I'll start with Marie. Marie, what is it that, what does waste mean? I think let's deal with the most basic of all issues. What, according to you, would qualify as waste? What is waste management? What might be the basic issues that we'd want to touch upon during this discussion that might prove to be useful for our audiences in the recorded version and live version as we go about it?
Thank you, Ishan, and thank you, everyone. Maybe the angle that I would like to bring into this conversation is that indeed, as Ishan already touched upon a little bit, waste is a global problem. And for example, according to the World Bank, at least 33% of the waste humanity produces is dumped into open landfills and burned. And in low-income countries, this can be even 90%. Needless to say that this produces different economic and social consequences as well as environmental impacts, both for pollution on land, rivers and oceans, and climate change, because waste, it produces greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And the Global World Bank report further elaborates that solid waste generated 1.6 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, which is a whopping 5% of all the global emissions. Furthermore, the world population grows and rapidly urbanizes, and the amount of waste generated is projected to increase by 70% in the next 30 years, which means that we could create as much as 3.4 billion tons of trash annually by 2050. And therefore, we cannot treat waste simply as a material problem, but it also needs to be seen as a social problem that drives from the factors such as consumption, for example. How waste can be seen, it really depends how you define it. I think because it's such a complex problem, it does need complex solutions as well. So it really depends on the situation and who is defining it. Thank you.
I think that's a great point, Marie, and we're off to a good start because you've challenged the very definition of what we'll be dealing with. And it is interesting to note that, and quite fascinating, that the definition of waste would change depending on where you look at it from, because technically waste is something that is, colloquially at least, our understanding is that it's useless. There's absolutely no use of that thing that is produced. But maybe if we, and I'm sure we'll deep dive into the conversations on circular economy and such other things going forward, and maybe waste for some could be another man's treasure, as they say. So with that thought, I'll move on to Sulekha. Sulekha, if you'd like to address our opening statement.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ishan. So Marie made a very good point about what exactly is waste, and you already introduced circular economy. So what we also need to understand is waste is a consequence of a particular choice of an economic model that we are functioning on, which is what we normally refer to as linearity. So this is an extract, take, make, and waste sort of a model. And then we have an alternative approach that is coming and is being increasingly adopted by governments world over, which is circular economy, where you have closed loop systems. And that's where in your point about what waste, where one man's waste becomes other man's treasure comes into picture. But and also waste in this particular model, waste management is not just about about this externality that you're creating, which becomes problematic. It's also about not creating waste to begin with. So it's this idea of increasingly and progressively designing out waste from the entire structure so that whatever extracted materials that you're beginning with, it continues to remain in the circle for as long as it can. So I'll leave it at that for now.
That's actually circular economy 101 for people in our audience that who are not well acquainted with circular economy. As Sulekha touched upon, just to build upon her point, the whole point of circular economy, as opposed to linear economy, which she pointed out, is that you create loops in which you reuse, you first reduce and then you reuse, and you try and reuse the raw materials that have been used as raw materials for product X, and the waste of product X as raw materials for product Y. And that's how you increase the loops and make the loops larger and larger so that you can reduce waste in the longer run. So that's an interesting perspective on waste, but I think we're going a little too far ahead with our line of discussion. Let me bring it back a notch and go to Noopur. with not just the idea of waste, but why is it such a complicated issue? Why is it that it is hard to define it? What is the realm of waste management that one would be dealing with? And why is it so, as Murray already pointed out, it's a global issue, it's also a local issue, it's a democratic issue, everyone has a part to play in the issue. So what are the contours that we'd like to define it by, the whole problem of waste and waste management?
Oh, thank you, Ishan. Thank you, Sulekha. Thank you, Marie. So for me, waste management is something that I hold accountable to every other global citizen. So for me, I use this mask every day. So this mask has lived its hygienic life. It cannot be washed. It cannot be repurposed. So for me, this is waste. On the other hand, I also use a pencil, and these pencil shavings have no use for me. But on the other hand, for my 10-year-old cousin, this certainly has a use because she makes greeting cards out of it. So, what is waste for me may not be a waste for some other person. So, the point I'm trying to make is waste is very attached to our everyday life. And we cannot deny that there is no waste because to live is to create waste. And as and when we are living in this hyper consumerist world, we have failed to look for an alternative for this waste we generate. So, because this waste can be repurposed, reused for somebody or the other who is in use. So, today I would like to say that this waste is a commodity which can be turned into gold for our future.
So I think, Nooper, thanks for bringing. As I said, we need to backtrack and tone it down and start from the very basics. And thank you for taking us to the absolute basics of our everyday lives and examples from our everyday lives of how one man's waste is another man's treasure, or one man's waste is another child's treasure in your case. And again, a very important point that you raised there, which also ties into a lot of other discussions that we will be having about waste management, and especially the policy issues, because there are fiscal components to waste. But the need to commoditize waste, Sahid, the need to put a dollar figure to how one would benefit it, how to incentivize waste management. These are also some issues that we need to touch upon, because as Nupur said, these are almost issues of every global citizen, and each person by virtue of being is producing waste. uh, and as we go on defining what waste itself is, how do you try and commoditize it going forward if you have to bring a semblance of marketplace reduction?
Thank you very much, Ishan. We'll try as much as possible. In terms of waste is, it could be seen from different figure. One, it could be seen as a resource, whereby it flows from one aspect to the other, and it could be seen as a form of commodity, which of course it has high impacts in the environment. In terms of being, I will start by saying, in terms of being as a goods, we can be public goods and also private goods. In terms of public goods, waste that are actually being generated by people is actually being deposited in the environment, and this actually can have a high impact in destroying the environment. And metabolism of the city states that the public health of the people is very much eptom, and taking care of incentivizing waste management, I think public policy can actually be put in place to actually incentivize the management of wastes. And in terms of the market value, people try as much as possible to create what the seller is, what the buyer is in the circular economy. So I feel that one way we could actually talk about incentivizing the bringing a market value to waste is appreciating that waste is actually a commodity that can be remanufactured into that can be recycled and we can reuse as well. So I think that's one way we can actually incentivize it.
That's actually a very interesting point, because you can commoditize it, but you can also treat it as a natural resource for what is to come later. And that also gives you a perspective, a very thin line that some of us very often miss as well. as to how it could be not just a financial or a fiscal resource for what is to come, but in its more inherent and intrinsic sense, it could just be raw material for what is to come. But why is it this big an issue? And if it is this big an issue, Sahid, then I'm coming back to you. Why is it so low in the priority list of the governments around the world? Have we been able to pin, because we all know that it has climate impacts, it has environmental impacts, the raw materials that go into making waste, if you're talking about plastics, for example, are almost non-biodegradable. So why does it not come up in the priority list of waste managers and governments and policymakers? And I'll open this up for all of our other panelists to think about and ideate as to why no proper policy that has been effective, at least, been able to see the light of day.
I think the case is that it's actually a nonchalant approach from different governments. And people do not before now see waste as a commodity. Only very few countries actually see waste as a very good commodity. I will talk about the case of Switzerland, Sweden as well. Sweden actually have been recycling waste for so long and have developed a lot of infrastructure to recycle waste. Recycling of waste actually takes a way of rebuilding the infrastructure. A lot of countries that have developed, they've had a lot of their infrastructure comparatively permanent, and reviewing some of this infrastructure to be able to like give room for waste management has been a very, very core issue before now. And I see that as a way of nonchalant attitude of some of the government, because you have to like, for instance, wastewater, you need to draw a lot of terrain for mobilizing waste, either by decentralized or centralized means. And a lot of countries, a lot of cities are actually are built infrastructure around centralized means, find it very difficult to bring about new policy to decentralize because it involves recreating the city in itself. So I think these are actually one of the challenges that have actually made a lot of cities actually, or a lot of governments make waste management a very, very low priority. But with recent impact of waste on climate, produce greenhouse gases that is actually bring about increase in temperature, I think this actually, it has now come to the fore that waste is actually very much important and it needs to be treated with huge urgency.
And your point of how it requires infrastructure, it requires certain capital investment from the get-go to get into the business of recycling, business of reusing, that also puts some pressure upon the governments to actually delay the decision as to these policies and, you know, probably turn it over to the next generation who can deal with it later. And that's the usual nonchalant attitude that you refer to. But since you took Sweden's example, I'll go to Murray. And Murray, if there are any infrastructural points, any financial incentives that the governments in your vicinity that you might have seen, how they have made it a bottom-up approach to handle waste. And it's not just the duty of the governments itself, but that of citizens to cut down on waste. Because one challenge that we all have noticed over our research is that unlike what Nupur said, that waste is a very democratic issue, it relates to everyone. We have somehow turned over the onus of doing something about the waste onto the governments and not taken any role in it actively. So given the fact that some of the Scandinavian countries are better at handling the issue of waste, have there been any lessons that you might have noticed of a bottom-up approach or creating awareness about the qualms of waste or what there is to make out of the money that is to be made out of waste in terms of management?
Well, maybe the aspects that I could bring into that conversation is that in Nordic countries in general, waste management is something that is being implemented already in education systems. So from very early on in schools, for example, we are being taught the impacts of what waste does for the environment, for example, and how we can prevent that, for example, through recycling. And I think it plays a big role in the long run. But also, for example, in Sweden, recycling has just been made very easy, because everywhere you go, you see different garbage bins where you can sort your waste. And you have information, for example, if you move into a new locality. And it's also this cultural awareness, I think, more in general, that it is.
Which I'm assuming comes through generations of creating awareness, which comes through years of educating people from the grassroots level, from a young age, that waste is a big issue. And that's how you kind of inculcate the system of appreciating that you must not waste. And as we trample into the various facets of waste as we go along in this discussion, and I'm mindful of the fact that we did start a little late, so we'll have to cramp up a lot of the discussion within the next hour or so. But moving on to on the dimensions of waste, as Marie talked about, Nupur, and the bottom-up approach that we have been speaking of. You think that is something that is lacking in the developing countries, or is it just a hard pill to swallow to them because they get money from importing waste, even though they just dump it in their landfills? Because there's an IR angle to that as well.
So, I mean, definitely there are a lot of things that can be attached to managing waste, especially at the local level, because it can be blamed on the citizens of the country that they are not segregating waste at the source. So when we start segregating waste at source, then a lot of our problems will be solved, and it will be easier for the government to solve this. And also, talking about the case of Sweden, it started this waste management process early in the 1960s. So the developing countries were nowhere there to counter that. So, and also the other thing to add to it is this process of transitioning to something, not converting to zero waste, but doing lesser waste, will take a lot of work, and also a lot of time will also be taken in this whole transition process. So, I mean, I feel the problem is there needs to be a behavioral change that requires to be done at the local level. So waste education is very important.
So a couple of very good points, Lekha, before I come to you, and I'll just wrap those up and throw them at you. One is that it requires time, it requires fiscal resources, it probably requires commoditization and revamping of the commodity structures when it comes to waste. It also requires behavioral change. And another issue that we might be dealing with is that waste over the years, or at least over the past 2 decades or so, has become such a vast topic to cover, because it's not just waste anymore. It's plastic waste, it's waste water, as Sahid mentioned, it's e-waste, it's biohazard waste, it's radioactive waste, it's medical waste. So as we have kind of unlaid the whole concept of waste, as a policymaker, it's very difficult to grab hold of any one topic and then legislate upon it, or come up with a policy for 50 types of waste, because all of them require different expertise, as we might already have noticed. So how do we handle that, Sulekha? Or is there something beyond this issue?
It is actually a very complex issue, and I don't think that there's a one size fits all solution as far as the diversity of the kind of waste that are concerned. And a very important point we miss in it is the role of stakeholders. So for example, in the case of plastic waste, there's a need to reduce, firstly, there has to be a competitive advantage, right? So as long as polymers and petroleum-based products continue to be very cheap, there's no way you're going to eliminate plastic pollution. And that goes down to the producers itself, right? If you're not giving alternatives and incentive to grow as far as plastics is concerned, you're going to continue to face problem with the issue of plastic waste. And then the second is shifting of responsibility. Normally the idea is that, producers produce it, they mark it, and they say, oh, they grade into different sort of what is recyclable and not, and suddenly the responsibility is put on the individual consumer, and the individual consumer then puts it on the government, because they say, right, you are the ones who need to provide us infrastructure. So what is happening is you're passing the buck of blame around, but no one's actually doing anything about it. So that is, you require absolute engagement on all stakeholders and find a collective solution. It cannot come from one or the other parts. And then there is this idea of extended producer responsibility that has been increasingly being enforced. So that would mean that I know, for example, electronic companies have been doing that. There's a lot of value actually which is lost in the informal and the non-proper disposal of electronics. So that there's this concept that exists of what you call urban mines. So all the precious metals that are used in these electronics are actually of increasing value, because extraction is having a lot of environmental, human rights consequences, to name a few. So all of this has to be kind of looped in and chained in, and this will not come at one level, it has to come at multi-stakeholder level.
So that's a brilliant point, Sulekha. And again, you've touched upon a very pertinent issue: extended producer responsibility or extended producer liability, depending on which part of the world you're coming from, is being seen as the way to go forward. And what basically happens, in my understanding, is that the price to internalize the waste that is produced through your product as a manufacturer is put in the maximum retail price of that commodity, which means that you are either passing on the burden to the consumer or taking on the burden yourself as a manufacturer, which increases the price of the goods itself. And that makes it not as financially viable to keep buying products that are wasteful or that are difficult to be biodegradable over a certain amount of time. But these are some of the policy measures that are still being explored in my understanding. But what is it that let's look at the global issues first, as Murray mentioned, and then probably look at what could be done to create awareness or education, because these are all very complicated issues, and especially in the global South. We do not even understand, or we're still just starting to begin to understand how we could address these issues. So let's go global, and we have already observed trends of how some of the global North, countries of the global North, are exporting their waste to countries like Vietnam, Philippines, and what has been the response of these governments? Are they rising up to these challenges? And how are they planning to deal with it? How were they dealing with it before this? What is the way forward? Is there any change in the recent outlook of these governments around the globe? Saheed, I come to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ishan. And I would like to re-emphasize on the first question you gave to me. I didn't do justice to that question. You talked about creating a market for waste. My head has been a little bit racking. I didn't do justice to that. So I think in some countries, I could recall some countries that provided some incentive through government participation. Consumer, after consuming, their waste are being sold and they get money in exchange for it. So that's a very good way where government was able to create a market value for the waste itself. And before that actually comes, before that, there was an experiment. If you take a bottle of Coca-Cola, the bottle itself, it's a property of Coca-Cola. You have to return to it. And that is a way of creating an incentive, because you've already, Coca-Cola make sure that the consumer also pay for the bottle, for taking the bottle. whereas the bottle remains the property of Coca-Cola. And by the time you do that, so that's a way of recycling and creating the market. And I've seen some other countries do that, where the plastic are actually being sold by the consumer, and that actually helps us in sorting and recollection of waste. And that's a very good incentive in terms of policy wise by some of this government. And looking at the fact that
Saeed, I think we lost you there for a bit. But Saeed brings to the fore a very important question, and there was something that we discussed in our circular economy lecture during the fellowship as well, which is how do you incentivize people to move over from waste? And some of the points that came through, and probably you could elucidate upon it, Nupur, as well, that how do you encourage a corporate, because we also need to look beyond governments at some point, while the responsibility solely lies on the governments to enforce policies, but there's also, as we've been talking about, the commoditization of waste that needs to be looked at. And for commoditization, there have to be financial incentives. So a couple of things that came through was, how do you convince someone, a corporate, a private entity, that you will make profit out of this if you switch to reuse, recycle, extended ownership of your own products, maybe? Or so how do you have that conversation with the private entity, which, if I'm not wrong, Coca-Cola, example of which Saeed took, has the biggest waste footprint on the globe. So how do you have a conversation with a private entity with such a global footprint to disincentivize them from creating such a large amount of waste on an annual basis?
So, I mean, corporates work on this measure of profit and loss. So, basically, we need to talk to them in terms of that only. So, before even talking to them about profit and loss, there needs to be a change in demand for the consumers themselves, because they are dependent a lot on what the consumers are demanding. So, I mean, the consumer demand needs to be changed. And as and when the consumer demands change, the corporates themselves will adapt to it. So, this is the part that needs to be done by the consumers themselves. So, on the other hand, if I personally want to convince as a government on corporates, so maybe what I can do is, as and when we have a big dumping site, we have 3 dumping sites in the capital city in India. So what do you feel? It's waste has a lot to do with the beauty, and every country wants to show the beautiful part of it. And these corporates have a lot of foreign investors. So how do you show your country? It's very important. You want to show the clean part of it. So that's one of the way that you want to make your country beautiful. That's a patriotic way of how you can incentivize them. You don't want to show the dirty part of it. So that's one of the ways. The second ways can be that something that was done by one of the IS officers, that is administrative service officer in Andhra Pradesh. So what he used to do was do meetings near the dump yard. So, and he used to ask his other colleagues not to wear any mask or not to use any handkerchiefs for the same. So, because as and when you realize the urgency of that situation, that okay, this will someday or the other will affect me. So then you start realizing, because till the time it's not affecting you, you will not take account of that problem.
Some extremely putting in the face in your mirror sort of points by Nupur, and really well taken as well. I see that Saheed is back. Saheed, we lost you in the middle. Would you want to complete your point about how ownership needs to be extended of these products so as to reduce waste? To your Coca-Cola example, I think that's where we lost you. Rishka, can you make Saheed the co-host, please? Yes, Saeed.
Yeah, thank you very much. In terms of ownership, I see that as a way of allowing corporate bodies to take responsibility for some of these wastes, because it's becoming now a case of impact on climate change. And corporations have been forced to agree to the fact that they will reduce their carbon footprint by 2030. And on this note, several companies now are trying as much as possible to find a very legitimized means to convince their consumers to exchange the wastes for money. And some of them actually have developed a kind of a machines where they put in pedestrian walkway, pedestrian sides, they put in public places where they go. So I think that's a way of making people take ownership, because climate change is a global issue. And through that, several corporations have signed an agreement. I could talk about the airlines. The airlines have made a commitment to change the airlines fuel to renewable sources. And this is a very good commitment, because that actually have shown that they are now more inclined into renewable and commitments towards ensuring that climate change impact is reduced. And so also some corporations like Coca-Cola, which of course have attempted to reduce the amount of waste that is generated from the bottles. Doing that, I think, is a way of taking ownership.
I think both of them are really good points, Saeed, and that's been the global discussion over climate change generally, and especially about waste, about making commitments and trying to reduce footprints. I'll go to Sulekha quickly before I come to Marie again. Sulekha, there is a lot of activity that is happening, as Saeed rightly said, on the basis of cutting down your carbon footprint as a private entity or as a government, especially in light of what happened with the Paris Agreement. But do you see any inherent issues with such commitments, apart from the fact that they cannot be regulated at all and there are no checks and balances there?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the biggest problems is that the cost and value are not being identified as separate entities. So normally what I will stick to the example of plastics, right? So when you look at plastics, or let's say a PET bottle, it looks like a cheap option compared to other sorts of alternatives that you might have. But what you do not understand is the amount of extraction that goes into it, the human cost at which it comes, and also of course the environmental impacts. And so while it might be a cheap option in terms of price, in terms of other costs, human, social, and environmental, it's a massive cost. And that is something that none of these agreements talk about. It's one thing to agree to cut down carbon emissions, but this is a whole, we could say, the bottom part of the iceberg that no one talks about.
And that's actually a interesting point, because you haven't accounted for any of the costs that come from the mining of these raw materials, from ridding some place of these waste materials eventually, because eventually most of them do land in landfills. So how do you deal with that situation, Marie, when you have to account for the cost, bring in actual cost of the product, the waste that it generates, the impact that it has on the environment, apart from commitments that may or may not be enforced eventually? What do you do about that? I do apologize for our audience members. These seem to be hard-hit questions, but the whole point of this discussion is ideating over issues that are plaguing us. So we have to deal with some of the larger issues at play.
Well, I think that is a very complex issue, and it definitely needs someone who is much smarter than me, who knows how to identify these things. But in general, from global policy perspective, we need to understand the whole life cycle of global value chains and treat them equally. Because if you, for example, think production that is happening in more developing countries versus the profit that it brings, for example, companies in the global north, they are not necessarily equal. But also these global value chains equally, they are very difficult to trace, and to understand. For example, there was research done by the Finnish government that where does their textiles in the end go? And though the government officials, they thought that they would be going into Switzerland where they would be ecologically disposed, in the end, it turned out that they actually went to Africa. So, I mean, we need to deal with those discrepancies as well. But when we're dealing with global value chains, the challenge is also the fact that different countries have different needs and laws, for example, that taken in place. And at the moment, there really isn't a very coherent global network or alliance to address this issue. So I think that it does require a lot of collaboration and transparency from the governments, and need to change the paradigm shift.
I could not have said it better, Marie. I mean, I think you set the bar too low with your first statement saying that you're not smart enough to address the issue, and then you addressed it absolutely fine. So point taken. I think Marie has also raised an important issue there, because ultimately it is finding common goals both for the private sector and the public sector. And the specific example of Finland that Marie took is something that stares us in the face, because this happens not just with African countries, but Southeast Asian countries, or generally the developing world. So how do you bring on board different governments with this common goal? How do you again disincentivize, say, a country from the global north that you should not be producing as much? If I could just take you through some of the statistics, while China's share of global municipal solid waste in the world is the largest at 15.5%, if you look at the average per capita waste per kg per day, per kilogram per day that is generated, that's the highest for North America, so Canada and the USA, which is almost 2 kilograms of waste per person per day. So you also have to take into account the equity aspect of it all, and how it is almost always the communities that are already suffering that suffer the brunt of this all. So how do you address all of these issues in the global space? I come to you, Nupur, and then to Sahib, please.
Okay, I mean, addressing such a big issue is a problem, because as a global community, we've been trying very hard to reach on a common ground on climate change. But that's not the case, that we have not been able to do something that is affecting the entire world. I mean, we look at the issue of terrorism. When the year 2001, USA declared a war on terrorism, and every other country was supporting on this global issue. So, I mean, it's the same case with climate change, but the point being, we have still not been able to understand the importance of the issue of climate change. We've still not been able to understand that there are linkages to what is going in the Middle East. It's the lack of resources, it's the lack of water resources, lack of land, lack of agriculture, lack of food. We need to link the entire war in the Middle Eastern countries to this aspect of climate change, and that is why wars are happening. Because we, even the developing countries like India and China, and now, I mean, the developed countries, we have exported all our problems to the underdeveloping countries. So that's why now we do not understand. We feel that this is not an issue that requires urgency to be solved. But then, yes, we have the negotiations. I mean, we have completed the negotiations for the Paris Agreement. There are still 10 countries left. And with God's grace, we will have United States back, and we will have the funding. So yes, we can hope for a very good future in terms of climate change. And the major role, what I said in my previous statement also, that a major role will be played by the global citizens, because what we will ask as citizens from our government, they will do that. So we just don't want development, we also want our environment.
That's a very good point, Nupur, because you kind of brought the discussion down to global citizens instead of global North and global South, and that there's a sense of a clarion call for unity of action when it comes to waste management and climate change as well. Sahid, before I come to you, Sulekha has a comment to make. Sulekha, would you want to go ahead?
Sure. I think Nupur makes a very interesting point, and I think it would help to kind of situate it within three frames. So you would look at fragility, finitude, and fairness. And I think when it comes to waste management, all these three layers work in very well. And in order to address that, again, I couldn't reinforce it enough. Individual responsibility is going to go a long way, because the usual approach, despite all international climate talks, all engagement, has been in not in my backyard, not my problem syndrome. And that is something that has to be addressed. And I see encouraging signs. For example, Australia recently declared that it's not going to export its waste anymore. And then we have countries like China coming in and saying we are not going to take any more plastic waste anymore. So once you have all these borders for a change coming down for a very good reason, and the problem is facing the people who are creating the waste, I think there's going to be much more incremental change than we see right now.
Yes, this was kind of what I wanted to touch upon going forward. So thank you for that segue, Sulekha. In fact, this was the question that I was supposed to ask Sahid about as well. That we're seeing that behaviors of communities are changing with time. As Sulekha mentioned, China is refusing to import plastic waste. I think there's a similar case in Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, one of the Southeast Asian countries which have said no to any more cotton waste and basically dumped waste that was dumped on their shores earlier from the US and Canada. So do you see the paradigm changing, Sahid? And if it is changing, is it changing at a pace that is conducive to sustainable growth of this planet?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ishan. And before I go there, I would like to comment on the internalization of environmental costs.
Yes.
I think it's actually very much imperative. There's a way the government can actually link that and support the corporations in internalizing the costs. Several corporations are actually willing to take up the alternatives to some of the materials they use, but it's going to increase the cost of production. And they need, on the other side of the government, to relax the taxes. If government can relax the taxes, it will enable the corporations to be able to take alternative means. And in this way, there could be a balance, and the burden will not be on the consumer, because everything actually falls on the consumer, because the corporation will have to ensure that they make profits. So that's one of the way I think this can actually go by. And looking at the global dynamics and transboundary waste transfer, I think currently in my upcoming publication, I argued that countries are actually winning the narrative by implementing policies to secure the boundary against waste. But I think they are losing the substance, because some of these waste that are actually being transferred from one country to the other, the recipient country actually found it to be very more beneficial. Internally, the amount of waste that is generated by most countries do not out that of the one coming from outside. But one big problem they do have is that sorting of waste takes a longer process. Behavioral change, like Mary and Nupu have said, to actually be able to carry that out. And stakeholders are going to involve, so it involves a lot of human resources, a lot of investment to do that. So internally, they couldn't sort out some of this waste. It ended up in landfills. It has caused disaster in India. It has caused disaster in Philippines. And countries are still trying to manage that. But the waste coming from outside, they are actually partially salted, if not entirely salted. Before now, it was very, very salted. But now that some of these developed countries are actually imbibing contamination into some of the salted material, I think they're now rejecting it. But waste is a very fantastic resource that can actually generate income, because China before now allows the accommodation of waste, because they know that processing this waste allows them to repackage some material and send it back to the United States and make money from it. So waste is a resource, which of course you cannot say you're implementing policy now Other countries are willing to take up this waste because they actually could find way of manipulating these wastes to be able to repackage some products. I think one big issue we need to look at is in terms of our consumptions. There's some products that actually we do consume now that we do not have the process to actually be able to degrade them or recycle them. And that is a big issue. I think our consumption is far away ahead than our innovation in waste management. And that is a very shift in paradigm now to how do we manage our consumption, and or do we have the relevant knowledge or innovations to be able to manage the waste generated from our consumptions. And some universities are now currently focusing on waste of emerging concern, which of course talks about the microbeads that are put in toothpaste. Currently now they are found in wastewater. It is very difficult to manage. Some plastics are very difficult to degenerate, to degrade, to actually convert them into useful products. So that is a new paradigm changing. On the issue of transfer of waste from one country to the other, I think implementing policy does not necessarily solve the problem in a long term. It does in a short term, but in a long term, is actually putting them at a very disadvantage. So we need to focus on new wastes, new innovation to actually be able to degrade the waste. That's the new paradigm now.
So innovation, so we have touched upon commoditization, education, innovation. And now I'll draw from a point that Nupur had raised earlier. And because we're going to be opening this discussion for Q&A, because we have about 25 minutes left. So please feel free to jump in about this. Yes, Marie, you had a point.
Yes, I would just like to build on Sahid's comment on consumption, because indeed, when we are talking about reducing waste, we also need to understand one of the core reasons why we are consuming things. And this is the fact that we are, if you look at environmental systems, you don't have waste in there because everything is being used. If you, for example, think leaves that fall from the trees, they go back to the energy cycle. But when you look at human systems, we are social beings, and the way how the current societies have been built is that when you, for example, are consuming things, you have the newest clothes or the newest shoes. This is how you build the fact that you are, and this comes back to, for example, advertising and marketing. So we need to really create a shift that helps us to realize that we are not just what we consume, but we are also people, and we are valuable as such.
And we're part of a bigger ecosystem, and not just producers of waste, so to say. I was going to throw a couple of points out, and anyone can jump on if they so wish. One is to Nupur's point that that's the whole issue of waste is almost emblematic of what is happening with climate change. But one of the arguments that have been drawn as a distinction between waste as an issue and climate change as an issue is that waste can be seen. Waste is tangible. You can see the mountains growing. You can see the landfills growing. You can see the plastic coming on shore of oceans. Versus climate change, that is not that easy to decipher in the short run or in a tangible way, unless you're looking at glaciers receding and all. So how do you address that distinction, where most of the times our excuse against climate change is that, I cannot see and I cannot figure out if those deaths were because of climate change or because of asthma that was occurring because of air pollution, which is leading to climate change, versus an issue where you can see a landfill growing. So one would assume that a way out for waste management should be a lot simpler, or the fear psychosis that could be developed in the producers of waste will be a lot easier because you're living next to that waste, or it's happening to a community outside your city. So how do you address that juxtaposition of climate change and waste management? And just before I open that question up, Nupur, because I know that you were about to say something to that effect, I also want to touch upon, I mean, we would be remiss if we do not talk about fast fashion and water wastage, because those are two very important things that have been talked about in the recent academia and scholarship. So that is also something that I'd like to touch upon before we take any questions that we might have from our audience members. Nupur?
Yeah, I mean, I was just about to speak about fast fashion. I mean, how can we in a globalized age can not say talk about fast fashion? Because so one thing with fast fashion is fast fashion was in a decade very famous because it suited to the changes of the market, that is demand and supply, and everybody thinks wanted things to be quick. I mean, they wanted the fashion to be replicated. So now, but today the case is we want to be friendly to our environment. So we want something that's friendly fashion to suit our environmental changes. So I've got a few numbers which I was reading on the New York Times. So you know what the problem with the fast fashion is? It's 60% of the fabric fiber is synthetic derived. So that means we are using 60% of the fossil fuel. And this 60%, I mean, if we take one shirt which has got 60% of fossil fuel, it, I mean, and it was also given there these will not even decay, because I mean it's 85% of these products will not even decay, so these will directly go into the oceans, and these will hurt the sea animals directly, which is like a very a thought that comes very later to our mind, because everybody wants to be fashionable. It's a manifestation of how we look, how we want to portray ourselves, and we cannot even blame anyone for it, because we everybody here is in a consumerist society. So I mean, my counter to that will be we need to make the alternatives a little bit cheaper so that everybody can afford it.
So
I mean,
making alternatives competitive would be the way to go. But
yeah,
I'm surprised that so 60% of all fast fashion commodities are synthetic. That's
yeah, I mean
surprising.
almost, yeah.
Yeah, and it's also because I think Nupur also refer to non-biodegradability of some of those raw materials, which means that we're dealing with things like forever chemicals, and many of these things, and we haven't even touched upon the fact that the cost of water, or the virtual cost of water that goes into manufacturing of these products, is also heavily skewed against developing nations, or the countries from the global south, because water is cheaper, and water is not commoditized, or the market is not as prevalent as it is in some countries in the West. So that creates another issue. Any thoughts on fast fashion and how we could address the issue? At least some ideas that could be seen as solutions before we take up questions.
I think in my opinion, I think before now, one of the disaster humanity would have faced or currently still face is on internalization of environmental costs. I think if we had done that, we have presumably thought about what is the consequence of our actions on the environment. I think we would have changed the dynamics of the way we appear, the dynamics of the way our lifestyles goes, our attitudes towards the environment as well. Take, for instance, during this COVID-19, you could see a lot of environment relatively changing because several of those fossil fuel that we pump into the atmosphere daily reduced. And in fact, I had some colleagues that walked through the streets of Amsterdam. I was like, he had a very different feelings. So we used to be very jam-packed and very, very, very crowded. So I felt that one way we could do this is we could make an effort to ensure that internalizations of environmental impact of whatever resources that we want to actually consume, either by corporations, is estimated on the impact of the environment. And through that, our lifestyles, the juggling we do, the clothing, will actually goes a long way to reflect that.
Saeed, do you think that we have the kind of modeling techniques that we require to come up with the proper cost of environmental damage that each of these products cause? Do we have that that sort of system already available, or is it still a work in progress? It's an imperfect system, and that's why people do not trust it to include the price of waste in the commodities.
I think it's actually very much dynamic in internalization of environmental cost. It's very dynamic. It depends on the society, it depends on the people, the institutions, the raw materials, and also the context as well. When we looked at the case of the small island countries where the internalization of the cost of climate change was first estimated, and where people have land, they have a small amount of water, and they have the ocean. The salination of the ocean water is comparatively heavy for them. And of course, at one point in time, people were comparatively suggesting that people should leave the land and move to somewhere else. And some people said, no, this is my land. The land belongs to me. I belong to the land. So this pushed a lot of scientists to start estimating what is the costs of climate change. So that actually brought about this. And we could also talk about what is the cost of using a fossil fuel, like drilling of a well in a community in, let's say, in Ondo State in Nigeria. What is the cost of drilling that well? What is the impact on the society? What is the per capita income of that community? Relocating that community, what would that? So it's really a somewhat imperfect system. It is contextually based, and it takes to estimate what is exactly the cost, the influence on the social capital, on so many things. So I think it's actually very.
Thank you so much, Saeed. That's a great insight into how this is actually done. I had recently read somewhere, in fact, let me come back to that point because we also have questions waiting. So unless we have any other comments on environmental costs being internalized through these modeling systems that are taking place and how they're very context specific, as Saeed mentioned, I'll just move on to a couple of questions. So one is a very interesting observation by Deborah, who says that we're having parallel discussions on space and waste. And people who care about space or want to infiltrate space are the people who want to leave Earth at some point because of the waste that is being generated. I'm obviously paraphrasing. But her point is that people who are in the race to get to space, why would they care about Earth? So I think that's more of a rhetoric question, Deborah. Point well taken. We also have a question from Sushruti, who says, Nupur talked about us being in a hyper-consumerist world, and I think that's an important aspect we need to address, and perhaps more urgently than even the recycling and management of waste. Perhaps it is time to take a hard look at the policies which make it economically less lucrative to generate waste, as Ishan and others pointed out as well. So this is an argument that comes up a lot, and I'll come to Sulekha because Sulekha has studied this topic in some detail as well. Some people say that if you have a limited amount of resource, which almost all the nations, even of the global north, have, no one has unlimited resources. If you have limited resources, then you should start curtailing the manufacture of waste and use those resources in curtailing the manufacture of waste instead of curtailing or promoting the recycle of waste or going down the loop, as you would say in terms of circular economy. So if you have limited resources, Nupur, and you only concentrate on curtailing down the waste in the first place and producing less waste, that could be by increasing the cost of commodities or otherwise. How do you use your resources more efficiently in terms of policies and fiscal benefits?
Oh, thank you, Ishan, for the question. I mean, first, okay, was it me?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, and then we'll go to Sulekha. I'm sorry,
Okay, so sorry. Yeah. Okay, so first I would like to comment on what was going on in terms of fast fashion. So, I mean, my whole argument around this environmental debate is that we can't go on taxing people on what even they are wearing. That will be too blunt on the people. And instead of coming closer to how we want to perceive our environment in a beautiful manner, we'll keep them away from taking and taking a lifestyle that's more environment friendly. So I mean, first of all, there needs to be a change in this whole outlook of taxing people every time they are damaging the environment, because these are the people who will be the original change makers. And then only the government, and when these people will demand, then they can, go forward, ask their government to make these changes. I mean, perceive an environment that's good for them also, and that's good for everybody.
So that's Sulekha. If you have noticed, Nupur has opened the Pandora's box of carbon tax versus cap and trade. That also
I
kind of
did.
that also kind of segues into one of the questions that we've received, that what are the kind of policies that are happening internationally. Would you want to quickly touch upon these concepts that are going around, carbon tax as an alternative to cap and trade, as an alternative to circular economy as well? Hi, Sulekha, am I audible? So till we get Sulekha back, let me go to Marie. If you have any ideas about this, otherwise I could just. Sulekha, are you back?
Yeah, sorry, could you repeat? I lost you for a bit there. I have very bad connection.
No, that's all right. I was saying that we've also, building upon Nupur's point on carbon tax, we also have received a question asking about the international policies in place to address these issues. And my understanding is that carbon tax or waste tax is one of the issues, and so is cap and trade, and the equity-based model, and the whole idea of putting together a efficient circular economy in place to address these issues. So just wanted a bit of insight into how these things work, like a
Yeah.
quick 101.
Wow, that's that's actually a topic for a PhD thesis, but
I
I'll try to answer that as best as I can. I think what, again, like, coming to my initial remarks that I made, that this whole idea is based on the structure and economic choice model of linear economy, and we need to go back a bit into history to understand how this comes. And this is somewhere down the line related to the idea of colonialization, where you actually functioned on this assumption that resources are infinite and you can go on producing and nothing's going to change because nature is going to keep on giving. And that's what's being challenged to the extreme now. And as much as there can be efficacious resolution of all these problems through the market mechanisms, I think there's a requirement to step back and not see only market as a choice. There are other alternatives that you need to explore, and that would go to the idea of, again, including, again, you can build into the same language of economics, and they say social costs, environmental cost, human cost, but these are, again, value systems that need to be addressed, because the way more, and a lot of panelists also address the sociology, the psychology, and behavioral issues that come around it. Because of taking the example of fast fashion, it's about how you build your image, how you're perceived in the world. That's a huge psychosocial behavioral model that you're looking at. So all these things need to be very looked at in definitely in a systems thinking manner, but an interdisciplinary approach is something that needs to be inculcated, and we shouldn't heavily rely just on the markets to just magically fix everything. And also, just to remember, it's the markets that started creating the problem in the first place. You cannot really discount that from the debate.
So for our audiences, if you have failed to notice, we have little underpinnings of fiscal ideologies that are evident, with Nupur criticizing taxing everything and Sulekha criticizing reliance on markets for every solution. So you're free to make your own conclusions from there. If there are any other comments that would want to address that whole question about international policies, yes, Sahib.
Yeah, I think one thing about it is like following on what like you said, industrialization has been one key thing everybody is trying to achieve. Some countries are developed now because they're industrialized. And that's actually one basic context, because when you look at the industrialized countries, they do not have a lot of these resources. So they moved down to developing countries to exploit some of these resources. And because of the focus on capitalist ventures, it has actually ameliorated a lot of people's feelings for other kind of investment programs or other kind of governance programs like socialists. People think socialist is so bad. Socialist, I think, on one part, it actually talks about the welfare of the states, and inculcated welfare of the state actually talks about the welfare of the environment as well, because you have to give privilege to the environment, the ecosystem where we actually. So I think there should be a mix of the governance model from purely capitalists to recognizing the welfare of the environment as well. So I think we could go by then by improving lifestyle through that.
I could not have, even in my wildest dreams, imagined that that this discussion would be ending with our political ideologies and how markets are perceived and how taxes are perceived. But this is what makes for a very interesting discussion. I think our last question that we'll take up also kind of fits into. It's a very good roundup of how we started this discussion as to how we have to eventually create awareness, how we have to have a bottom-up approach to Sweden's example of 1960s education, and ever since then they've been teaching about the importance of waste. And Isha Shahi notes that what little things do you personally do and advise others to help reduce plastic waste? Also, is there any other solution for plastic waste? And I'm assuming any other alternative for plastic waste apart from reusing plastic or reducing its production.
I think there's an alternative.
Yes, Saeed, please go ahead.
I think there's an alternative. Implementing policy to reduce the consumption of plastic waste. That was actually being implemented in Uganda. Uganda passed a policy to prevent people from, to discourage people from using plastic waste. That was, I think, 5 years ago. So I think public policy can actually be used as an instrument where policy to discourage the use of plastics, bags and stuff like this can be used to contain plastic waste. Yeah.
Saeed, has there been any result of the policy that you mentioned? Are there any observable?
Yeah, in Uganda. Yeah, in Uganda, people now use bags. Instead of plastic bags, they use alternative. I think this was, renewable like that. Yeah. The government passed a policy. So it was very, very, and it reduced the amount of plastic waste that was generated in Uganda.
Okay, that's good to know. There's hope still.
Can I also jump in here?
Yes, please, Sulekha, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think the question is also about what you can do personally. And I will just bring in some insights from the previous panel that we have about public participation. And I think accountability is very important. And I know one of the fellows who's present here has actually written to corporates asking them what they plan to do about plastic waste. And they've got like really good responses. So even if it might seem like it might lead to nothing, but if you personally take that initiative, go out and ask what the people who are producing all of this are going to do about it, I think it goes a long way apart from just the usual reduce, refuse, recycle circle that all of us try to follow.
Yes, before I move on to Nupur, who had a comment, it seems, let me also give a shout out to Nivedita, who's in the audience. And Sulekha was referring to Nivedita when she said that she's written out to corporates and asked them what they're doing about their recycling and reducing practices. So Isha, if you want to get in touch with Nivedita, please feel free. I'm sure you can find her on LinkedIn. Nupur, and then Marie also has a point.
Yeah, I mean, it's really very easy if we look for alternatives. I mean, don't use a plastic bottle, use this bottle that's reusable. Don't have coffees in like that has a life one time. Take your own cups to the coffee shops. And like very important aspect to it is like your regular beauty products, the shower gel you are using, the shampoos you are using. We need to ask accountability from these brands. Okay, you need to take these back from us, and so that these can be refilled. So these are the few things that we as consumers can start asking are like, producers that provide us these things. So these are few simple things that we can do in everyday life.
So little things. Marie, you had a comment.
Yeah, I think Nupur already covered much what I was about to say as well. So in Sweden, you see a lot of leading by example. So if you can have your own, for example, lunchbox, we have plastic cups, you don't really see a lot of, for example, using a lot of plastic bags or things like this. But also people are very aware of, for example, different shops or companies, if they are environmentally friendly or not. And we have actually created a lot of different apps, for example, that show that how green some companies are. And you do see that people do avoid companies that are not green. And it really is also about finding these different alternatives, going to Google and talking about your friends and challenging people's thoughts as well.
That's a brilliant point. And Marie, I think we could not have ended the session on a better note, where we're promoting conversations about waste and how we can regulate it, and encouraging each other to have more conversations about this and spread the word about this. Just a last, from what I have been noticing recently, Isha, the conversations that are happening on alternatives, one of the biggest alternatives that is coming about for plastic is hemp. So hemp cultivation is going up, and it is being seen as a very sturdy replacement for plastic bottles. It can be used in construction industry. It can be used in various other industries. So you might want to look up the uses of hemp. That's HEMP. So that being said, guys, again, thank you so much. We've just run out of time, and we're nothing if we're not adhering to our time limit. I'm also concerned why we're restricting ourselves to the exact time limit is because some of us have stayed on for the past 3 hours, and we don't want them to exert too much. So thank you all who have stayed with us. Also, so Shruti, your point is well taken about CBA and an AI-like space for space, AI, waste, all of those things. So thank you so much. Thank you, most importantly, to our panelists. Thank you, Saheed. Thank you, Nupur. Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Sulekha. It has been an engrossing discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to continue this discussion. For those of you who were interested in today's talk, Rishka has already posted our social media handles, but you could also reach out to our fellows directly on LinkedIn, if you can find them on LinkedIn, and continue the conversation there. So thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us. I hope you had as much fun as we did. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey guys.